So this is the first video of the new semester. This is Sarah Hardy at the University of Maine at Farmington, and this is a video for my Math 120 introductory statistics students about using the calculator in this class. In this class, understanding the concepts is the most important thing, but the calculator is our hammer. It doesn't matter how well you understand the physics of how nails can go into a piece of wood. If you don't have a hammer, there's no way that you can get those nails in the piece of wood. But you also need to know how to use the calculator correctly. If you don't know how to use your calculator correctly, it's going to lead to a lot of frustration. So my goal in making this video is to make sure that we can start the semester and everybody has a hammer and knows how to use it. And to use the calculator correctly, you need to remember the order of operations. And chances are when you learned the order of operations, you were taught to remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. To remember P-E-M-D-A-S, sometimes referred to as PEMDAS. To remember parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. So parentheses are the king. They rule over everything, and they have the final say. Exponents include both x squared and the square root of x. Multiplication and division are really tied. They're inverse operations. Dividing by a number is just like multiplying by its inverse. For example, dividing by 2 is just like multiplying by 1/2. That's why those are tied. And addition and subtraction are also tied because subtracting is just like adding a negative number. So it would really be more correct to write it like this: P-E-M-D on the same line and A-S on the same line, with multiplication and division and addition and subtraction. When they're tied, whoever gets there first wins. In terms of calculators, you don't need a big fancy graphing calculator. If you want a physical calculator to hold in your hand, you can get a TI-30. I got one for $10 on Amazon just last fall. For some reason, they're like $20 on Amazon now, but I noticed they're $12 at Target and Walmart. Or you can use your phone. If you're going to use your phone, make sure that you download something, probably a scientific calculator app, because you want to have something that has the parentheses and the squared and square root so that it's all on the same menu. I downloaded this one on my phone yesterday because the one I had before started making noises when you push the buttons, which was annoying me. And so far this one seems to be pretty good. I looked and they did not have the exact same one for iPads, so I'm guessing they don't have it for iPhones either. I think the iPhones will work. So on an iPhone, I don't have one, but I believe from past students that what works is if you turn it sideways so that it's in landscape orientation, and then the built-in calculator will become a scientific calculator. So try that if you have an iPhone. And on the iPhone, if you hold it in the regular portrait orientation, the parentheses are buried a level deep, and it just doesn't work very well. Students just have had all sorts of problems trying to go down a level to use the parentheses. So, but if you just use it like this, I think it will be fine. So iPhone users, let me know if there's anything I'm saying here about the iPhones that's incorrect. On a problem like this one, where everything's just laid out in a straight line, if you enter this in your calculator as 235 minus 2.83 times 26, your calculator is going to do this operation first because multiplication rules over subtraction. So you can think of it as if your calculator is going to put the parentheses in for you like that. But since the calculator is doing it for you, you don't need to put those parentheses in yourself. So if you enter that in, you should get 161.42. What you don't want to do is add in parentheses where they're not needed, because remember, parentheses rule. So if you put the parentheses in, it's going to subtract that number 2.83 from 235, so you'll have something around 232. Multiply that by 26 and you're going to end up with something over 6,000. Now here's a problem where we have a numerator, 129.2 minus 139 divided by a denominator of 6.5. If you enter these numbers in without parentheses, your calculator, since division rules over subtraction, your calculator would do this piece first and then subtract it from 129. Your calculator would see that as doing this problem right here, which is not what we want to do. So in general, numerators and denominators do not play well together, so we need to keep them separated with parentheses. So here's a case where you do want to enter parenthesis 129.2 minus 139, the numerator, divided by 6.5. And if you enter it in like that, you should get negative 1.51. A note about calculators and how they do square roots before we go on to the next slide. In most calculators, you hit the square root first. So if you did your square root key 16, you would get 4. But there are some, mostly older calculators, where you put the number in first and then hit the square root. So you're going to just need to test this on your calculator and make sure you know which order it works in. And the second difference is whether or not the calculator automatically puts some parentheses in for you inside the square root. Some work just like I have it shown here. You hit a square root, you hit the 16, and you get a 4. And in this case, if you do have a more complicated expression inside your square root, you have to add the parentheses yourself. The other way, and I think this is now also more common, is that when you hit the square root, your calculator automatically throws up some parentheses. 16, you're going to have to close the parentheses to get your final answer. And one last way that I just discovered today in an app that I downloaded on my phone was putting up this box. And on this one, to break out of the square root, you can either just hit equal or hit the arrow key. So you're going to just have to experiment and find out, make sure you know how your calculator does square roots. And if you have any questions, either I or Our TA can help you out. I don't know right off the top of my head how every calculator works, so if you say I have such and such a kind of calculator, I won't know, but I can look at it and we can figure it out. Okay, so that was a really long explanation of square roots, but now back to what we were doing, the order of operations and how that works on your calculator. So what about this one? We have 73.8 minus 1.32 times 8.98 divided by the square root of 61. Your calculator is going to do the square root first, and then it's going to do this piece. So your calculator is going to do this piece first, and then subtract that result from 73.8. And so if you enter that in your calculator, you should get 72.28. Okay, so now let's look at this one. 5.78 minus 5.92 divided by 1.32 over the square root of 169. So numerators and denominators do not play well together, even though we don't always write the parentheses out when we're writing the problem out by hand. When putting it in our calculator, we always need to keep the numerator and the denominator separated by parentheses. So in your calculator, you want to put parenthesis 5.78 minus 5.92 parenthesis divided by our denominator parenthesis 1.32 divided by the square root of 169. Close that parenthesis. And if you put that in your calculator, you should get negative 1.38. So a note about rounding before we go on. When you put the last problem into your calculator, you'll get negative 1.3 and then 78 repeating, depending on how many decimal points your calculator shows and if it does the repeating sign. And suppose you want to round to 2 decimal places. We're going to just use the simple rounding rule, which is if the next digit is 5 or more, round up. So for this number, if we want to go out to 2 decimal places, our next number is 8, which is greater than 5. So for this problem, you would round up to negative 1.38. Do not just lop off the additional digits, because minus 1.37 would be the incorrect answer. Now, sometimes, of course, the next number is going to be less than 5, and so if you did just lop off the additional digits, that would be the same as rounding correctly, and so it might work. So you might do one problem and find out it works, and then the next problem you do the exact same thing and it doesn't work. It's getting marked incorrect. So if that happens to you, double check that you're rounding correctly. In general, in this class, we'll round regular numbers to 2 decimal places and percentages and probabilities to 4 decimal places. And if you don't like having 2 different rules, you can always round things to 4 decimal places. You'll never get marked off for putting in extra decimal places. But sometimes it can go the other way. You can get marked off for putting too few decimal places because it could cause your answer to be incorrect. And one more word of caution about rounding too much before we go on. It's most accurate to enter the equations in your calculator in one step. And what I mean by accurate is it will in terms of the calculations themselves inside the calculator, you'll get the most accurate answer. And it's also accurate in a second way, in that it's least prone to you making a mistake in entering the numbers. If you do want to break the equation down into steps, for example, do the numerator first and then the denominator, and then divide in a next step, you must take the intermediate calculations out to 4 decimal places. Okay? What I mean by that, if you're going to do the numerator and denominator separate, you need to take the numerator out to 4 decimal places and then take the denominator out to 4 decimal places. You need to do that even if you're going to be rounding your final answer down to 2 decimal places. Because if you round in the middle, you actually will throw the final answer off, and you can actually throw it off quite a bit. So really best to just do it all in one step. And if you're not going to do it all in one step, make sure to take middle steps out to 4 decimal places. So let's look at this next problem. It's a little more complicated than some of the previous ones. So first of all, we want to keep the numerator and the denominator separate. So we can start by entering the numerator in with parentheses. And everything in the denominator is underneath the square root sign. So you can enter divide square root. And at this point, your calculator might already automatically put in a parentheses here after the square root. If it doesn't, you'll need to add one. So inside the parentheses, minus 0.22 times parenthesis 1 minus 0.22 parenthesis divide by 67, and then close your parentheses. Either you might have to type that in, or it might already be there, depending on your calculator. And you should get equals 4.15. Now when you have parentheses nested inside other parentheses, things can get kind of complicated, and depending on what kind of calculator you're using, this might actually, the front part of the equation might scroll off the side before you get to the equal sign. So I always do a little simplification. And this somewhat goes against what I said earlier about doing things all in one step, but whenever I have a problem set up like this, and we're going to have a lot of problems that follow the same pattern, one number times one minus that same number, I like to just do that off to the side. A lot of times you can do it in your head, or you could use your calculator. So 1 minus 0.22 is 0.78. And no, you don't run into any rounding problems, because that's an exact answer there. So if you do that little step off to the side ahead of time, that reduces what you have to enter into your calculator into this much simpler equation and shorter. You don't have parentheses inside of other parentheses. So that's just one tip. You can do it either way. Personally, I do it this way, and this is what I recommend. We do a lot of problems that are set up this way, and this is probably where students run into more problems with their calculator than anything else. Okay, and one last problem here for today. And again, we see this pattern where we have one number and then multiplied by 1 minus the same number. And again, I like to do this little piece just off to the side before I enter anything in the calculator. And if you do that, you don't have any addition or subtraction left in the problem. Just exponents and multiplication and division. Multiplication and division play well together. Exponents automatically happen first, and you can just enter things in your calculator in this long string like this. 1.96 squared times 0.32 times 0.68 divided by 0.02 squared equals, and you should get 2089.83. So that about wraps things up for this video. Now you can go to WebAssign and do the calculator practice assignment.